Radio and KKFI. And it goes, whereas the media are vital instruments preserving democracy in the United States, and they shape our views of our nation and the world, whereas an aggressive press helps foil corruption in our corporate and public lives, and David Barsamian has been in the forefront of speaking truth to power, both here and abroad, and whereas David Barsamian, his public affair program, Alternative Radio, has been broadcasting on Kansas City Community Radio for over 10 years, and it's more than that actually, and has been helpful in informing citizens on important matters. And whereas KKFI seeks to stimulate, educate, and entertain Kansas City's audience to reflect the diversity of the local and world community, and to provide a channel for individuals and groups, issues, and music that have been overlooked, suppressed, or underrepresented by other media. And therefore, I, Sylvester James, Mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, on behalf of the citizens of this great city and the City Council, to hereby proclaim Alternative Radio and KKFI acclaim for the work that they have done to educate our citizenry, and hereby present this proclamation to David Barsamian as a token of our appreciation. Signed.
Okay, a couple of housekeeping things first. I was told by Alice Kitchen up here on the front row that she has petitions to sign for minimum wage, for Clean Missouri, and for
Health and Safety, Kansas City, Missouri.
Health and Safety, Kansas City, Missouri. You can find about all of that. She'll be taking your signatures for that if you haven't signed it yet. Okay, also I was to announce that there will be a discussion group discussing the book Global Discontents, Conversations on the Rising Threats to Democracy, which is the book, of course, that we're all here to honor with our guest tonight. That will be at KKFI next Saturday from 10 until noon if you want to come and join that discussion group. And if you want to buy one of those books, I'm sure that David will be happy to provide that for you.
And that's 8 days from now. It's not tomorrow. It's 8 days from now.
Yeah. For those of you that thought December 8th was tomorrow, it's not.
Thank you. It will be next Saturday.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all very much for showing up. This is although we're kind of joined at the hip with KKFI, this is actually a Friends of Community Media event. We appreciate all of you turning out and supporting that organization. You know, there's been a lot of talk since this new administration about the resistance, you know, and there's been a growing resistance movement, and I think that's very cool. But there have been those like our guests who've been part of that resistance way back before resistance was even cool to talk about. And David Barsamian is certainly one of those. Alternative Radio has been around since 1986, and it has covered all the issues that are near and dear to hearts of the people in this room. And I'm going to introduce David now. He is one of America's most tireless and wide-ranging journalists, integral part of the independent media landscape, both with his weekly radio show, Alternative Radio, in his 32nd year, and with his books and I'm going to murder some of these names. Oh, yes! Somebody forgot to remind me of that. So before I introduce, I will stop in mid-sentence and introduce Joseph, who somebody forgot to tell me that Joseph was going to come up and speak. I'm sorry. Joseph! Big hand for Joseph!
It's an honor to be here. I, like most of you, have been enlightened, educated, and illuminated by Mr. Barsamian's work. I was chatting with him briefly, especially about the work of the late, great Edwin Said, partially because of his beautiful prose and his work, Orientalism. And through the years, I've tried to keep up with it when I can. This particular poem, you may have heard some of my poetry on KKFI. I think Soft Boyish Hands is one, and John Wayne in the Ghetto. This is the title poem of a chapbook that Prospero's Books will be producing sometime for me in the new year. This is called Black Lives Matter, and this particular reading I dedicate to Mr. Barsamian. If you've heard it before, thank you for listening again. This is dedicated to the church I go to, All Souls Unitarian. I wrote it June 13th, 1915. Our first Black Lives Matter banner was stolen, and if you go to All Souls now, you find that it is in a very safe place. Anyway, this is the poem that I wrote to dedicate that first banner, Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter, yet the very air we breathe, this wondrous flesh we inhabit, our ever-resilient presence in this vast, recalcitrant land grab called America is casus belli. Black lives matter and have mattered since the Middle Passage. The cruel efficiency of slave patrols, whips, and pistols, along with the salubrious pleasures of coon hunts and lynchings after church. American power, with its oligarchs and hegemons, has always known Black Lives Matter when exercising their allegedly God-given right to terrorize through myriad blunt traumas, poll taxes, redlining, or that catchy buzzword, austerity. So-called liberals will slogan up the rallying cry, speak truth to power. Those in power already know Black Lives Matter, especially when the time comes for manufacturing Untermenschen before exterminating them in massacres for being uppity. From Roger Taney to Ronald Reagan, from Rush Limbaugh to Charles Koch and Prescott Bush, these acolytes of the pathology that is white supremacy know all too well Black Lives Matter in a most profitable, if savage way, because if Black lives did not matter, all these mechanisms, structures, and policies would implode. The fleeting comforts and elegancies accompanying white privilege would explode into a billion shards of shrapnel, leaving no white people at all, just people. From Darren Wilson to Bull Connor, from Woodrow Wilson praising Birth of a Nation to the bloviating flatulence of Fox News, Black Lives Matter as a fetish, much like a tar baby. Why do you keep wishing to be in the land of cotton when you are already here? From sea to shining sea, this is your country to run amok in. This is your country where you kept severed limbs and testicles as tchotchkes, much like your plundering brethren did with pyramids and other indigenous artifacts you hoarded into museums as gaudy testaments to your supposed civility. This is your country. You brutalize, then rationalize the atrocity of being in fear for your lives without so much as a scratch on you, while a black young man's corpse burns for 4 hours in the midsummer sun. Elegant courtier of manifest destiny that he was, you really shouldn't have listened to Rudyard Kipling. Do not blackmail us now with that sallow, silly notion of reparation. It will not absolve you in this, your beloved country of Eurocentric memory and Aryan promise, where beneath the twinned alabaster avarice of white supremacy and privilege lurks a death urge so abysmally psychotic and addictive, even Edgar Allan Poe couldn't stay sober enough to grasp its depth. its breath, its menacing metamorphoses. This is your country where Black Lives matter even more, because this is not an indispensable nation. You are not a chosen people. You are not a royal priesthood. How can a nation that gorged itself on genocide and slavery ever be? Brothers and sisters of the African diaspora, we know Black Lives Matter by our refusal, in our resistance, by our rebellions, and in our revolt. With the imminent threat of police gunning us down one by one, we summon the collective resilience of those who steadfastly and miraculously kept chasing the long arc of justice in the universe, to challenge and rise up against 400 years of terror by fiat, a genocide for the literal and existential hell of it, and profit of it. We will tear down the master's house. It is the only human and humane thing to do. It doesn't matter what plowshares or swords we use. We will take to the streets. We will riot if we must. We will tear down the master's house and subvert any ideology that presumes the master to have such a dubious title in the first place. We seek only justice, not revenge. For it is then, and only then, that the enslaved master will learn Black Lives Matter. They always have. They always will. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me of that. You certainly did more for this than that. Okay, you know, at KKFI, we're very proud of the fact that we've been doing progressive programming on our public affairs shows clear back to 1988. Well, it turns out that we're kind of following the lead of our speaker tonight, who actually started alternative radio back in 1986. Been going on for 32 years, and it's kind of a who's who of people in the movements and people we've all heard of and learned to appreciate. His books with Noam Chomsky, Iqbal Ahmad, Howard Zinn, Tariq Ali, Arundhati Roy, and Richard Wolff, and has been fighting the good fight for many years now. So a big hand for David Barsamian.
Kansas City! Great to be here. I bring you greetings from Boulder, Colorado. Yesterday I was in Kansas for the first time, incidentally. I've been traveling to Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, but had never been to Kansas. So I won't make any jokes about Dorothy or Toto. I'm sure you're bored to death with hearing them, nor will I refer to the Kansas City Chiefs and Alex Smith and the kind of season they're having. Let me get a little bit comfortable here. It's so great to be here and support a wonderful community organization like Friends of Community Media and KKFI, one of the best community radio stations in the country. Now, I travel all over the country. You should know, and you probably do, if you go to Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore or Miami, you know, these like liberal hotbeds of Marxist-Leninist thought, you know what? They would give their eye teeth to have a community radio station of the quality of KKFI. Not one of those cities has a community radio station. You think of Boston, oh, you know, Noam Chomsky's lived there for so many years, and Howard Zinn, and all these progressives. Nada. They have wall-to-wall NPR with their endless programming of Some Things Considered, as I thought. and Morning Edition, M-O-U-R-N. But, you know, we listen to NPR, right? Because we like to hear English spoken. We like to hear adverbs used properly. There's no yelling. But, you know, a lot of it, as Joseph mentioned in his brilliant poem, is bloviating flatulence. In other words, hot air, just gas emanating from these very pretentious and very self-important anchors and pundits and experts who give you, arguably, a range of opinion, no doubt about that. But it's from A to B. It's not from A to Z. So you get discussions about, well, what should we do about North Korea? What should we do about Iran? Should we bomb them now? And then you have an opposing voice saying, no, not now. Let's wait a few months. Let's put more sanctions on them, you know, create more international difficulties for them. You know, no one is talking about, hey, you know what? For those of you old enough to remember the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, there has never been a peace treaty signed. We have technically been at war with North Korea since 1953. That would be a great way to start, you know, a peace negotiations. Sit down. You know, I hate to quote Winston Churchill, who's the subject yet of another, you know, very admiring film that just came out. But he did say, it's better to jaw than to war. And war in Northeast Asia would be catastrophic. In fact, this is the topic of next week's alternative radio program with Eric Sirotkin on war or peace in Korea. There will be countless deaths in the millions. Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, is right near the 38th parallel, the DMZ separating North and South Korea. So any attack on North Korea will result in enormous casualties. It's unthinkable, actually, that it's part of the discourse, because we're talking about annihilation. Not, you know, not like a little war going on here and there. Two schoolboys in a schoolyard taunting back and forth, yelling insults. You're little, you're big, you're puny, you're this, you're that. These are the leaders of these countries. And today, in many respects, is one of the darkest days in U.S. history, in a series of dark days. I say that because it looks like McCain and Jeff Flake of Arizona, both of them are from Arizona, Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, and what other senator just caved in? Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. They're all going to agree to pass what is arguably, I don't think unambiguously, one of the greatest transfers of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the upper class, to the 1%. And when the president, I won't mention his name, I'll call him throughout this talk exalted leader or the great leader, you know, like the way they talk about Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He said it's going to cost him a fortune, this particular tax bill. Well, actually, a conservative institute just came out with a report showing that he and the class that he represents are going to benefit hugely from this tax cut. Now, when you hear, you know, tax cut, tax reform, you feel kind of good, right? Reform, we're all for that, right? Education reform, health reform. It means something good. But this is how the language is perverted. In this case, reform means taking money, you know, from your pocket and putting it in the pockets of the billionaires, the Sheldon Adelsons, the Koch brothers, the Rebecca and Robert Mercer and Steven Schwartzman and all these other hedge fund operators that control billions and billions of dollars. Right now, 3 Americans, that is to say Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, have more wealth than 50% of our population. We have 320 million people in this country. 3 people have more wealth than 160 million people. Now, is this good for democracy? Is this the kind of economic future that the much venerated and, I must say, overrated founding finaglers or founding fathers That's a Michael Parenti joke, thank you, Michael. The founding fathers envisioned? Of course not. They saw a more equitable society built around equality, although they had real problems in their own lives with equality, being slave owners and white males who had enormous privilege. You know, it's very easy to criticize the great leader, but I am grateful for one thing. I must say, for years I've been talking about misogyny and white supremacy and patriarchy, and I would see like a blank look in people's faces, and I would have to explain what that is. But this error has unleashed a tsunami of misogyny, has enabling racism. Did you see what happened in Charlottesville? Could you have imagined at the end of 1945, when the United States had finally defeated the forces of fascism, that fascist groups would be marching in the streets of the United States with torchlights and saying, Jews will not replace us, and Heil Trump. You can't imagine that. And after that event, what did the great leaders say? They're good people they're fine people. So instead of condemning racist and anti-Semites, and that's who they were chanting a well-known Nazi slogan, blood and soil, Blut und Boden, and conjuring up those images. So this is a very, I don't want to soft pedal this and kind of make you feel warm and fuzzy and cozy, because you shouldn't be. I think this is an extremely dangerous moment in the history of the United States when these forces have been enabled. The forces of racism, the forces of misogyny and white supremacy. So, unfortunately, thanks to the great leader, I don't have to explain what misogyny means, or white supremacy, or patriarchy, because it is so evident now to people. Yesterday I was talking at KU in Lawrence, and there you could see, the young people in that class who are the future of the country, the future media workers, the future journalists, and the kind of impact this kind of racist diatribes are having on them, particularly on people of color who are being singled out once again for lexical violence. That's the first step of genocide. That's the first step of killing someone. How do I know that? I know it from my family. We are in Sur Garabed, that's to say Saint Garabed, Armenian church. I happen to be of Armenian background. My parents went through the first genocide of the 20th century in 1915. In my mother's family, there were 25. Just a couple of people survived. The rest, 3 of my 4 grandparents were killed by the Turks. But you know what the first stage of the genocide was? Lexical violence. The Armenians are scum. The Armenians are traitors. The Armenians can't be trusted. The Armenians are controlled by outside forces, like Russia and France and England. So that was the first step in what became the first genocide of the 20th century. My mother finally did escape, got to Beirut, married my father there in 1921, and then they came to New York. And that was a huge influence on my background and shaping my view of the world, because I wanted to know, why did this happen? And so I became very politicized and very much interested in history. And I would ask the Armenian elders that had survived the genocide in New York. I was growing up in the 1950s. Well, what happened? Why did the Turks, turn on the Armenians? They had been living there for millennia in the land of Mount Ararat. And quite frankly, because this particular group was uneducated, they were farmers, they lived in rural areas, they didn't have access to schools and the like. They kind of lapsed into, well, the Turks hated us, they're bad people. They were very unsatisfactory answers. And so that, in me, just stimulated a desire to know why do things happen? What are the forces at work that produce outcomes like genocide? A genocide, incidentally, in this case, which Adolf Hitler intimately knew about. His closest confidant was a German vice consul in Erzurum in eastern, what is now eastern Turkey, part of historical Armenia. He came back to Germany after the war and told Hitler, you know what, this is what the Turks did to the Armenians, and nothing happened to them. They got a free pass from the international community. You know, there was no justice, and Hitler was very impressed by what the Turks did. He was also very impressed by what the United States did to its indigenous population here. He was greatly admiring of the reservation system. You know, first you wipe out large sections of the population, and then whoever is left, you stick them in inhospitable, hard-scrabble lands and let them try and, you know, make a living for themselves. So Hitler said on the eve of launching his attack on Poland, when he was addressing German generals in the Wolfslair, in the Berchtesgaden in the Alps, he said, don't worry, no mercy, and who remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? So that was very much in his mind, that, you know, one people got away with the mass murder of another people, and it stimulated him to carry out the Holocaust and other, of course, mass murders of gays and lesbians and communists and socialists. And that reminds me, speaking of Germany, do you all know about Pastor Martin Niemöller? Quite a historic figure. You should be familiar with him. N-I-E-M-O-L-L-E-R. He served in World War I on a U-boat. He won the Iron Cross. After World War I, he was transformed by that experience and became a pacifist, and he became a Lutheran minister. And he became part of the anti-Nazi resistance. He was in Dachau concentration camp from 1938 to 1945. But during the resistance, he created this famous poem. You might be familiar with it. It starts off with, "First they came for." And I'm going to change that a little bit to update it. So, first they came for the Muslims. And I didn't say anything, I didn't speak up. Hey, I wasn't a Muslim. You know, that's their problem. Then they came for gays, lesbians, transgenders, queers. I wasn't one of them. I didn't say anything. Then they came for the trade unionists, union organizers. Well, I wasn't a member of a union. I didn't say anything. Then they came for the communists and the socialists. Well, I wasn't one of them. I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Jews. Well, I wasn't Jewish. I didn't say anything. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak up. So this is a moment now, I think, that Pastor Niemöller echoes, his words echo today with a sense of urgency, where there is more than a whiff of fascism in the air. I know that's a very loaded term. I don't want to use it promiscuously, as it is sometimes invoked. But I think we should, you know, use words carefully, and there is a definite whiff of fascism in the air, the merging of corporate and state power. People, of course, are going to ask me, what can I do in this situation? That's the wrong question. The question has to be, what can we do? It's only through solidarity, it's only through collective action that movements grow and expand. You as an individual, however talented you may be, however well-meaning you might be, you won't be able to do much. You know, maybe you'll be able to write a clever editorial or, you know, give a talk somewhere. But ultimately, it's going to be about collective action moving forward. And, you know, again, KKFI is your electronic umbilical cord. Yeah. That's what brings you all together. That's why you're here. So don't be hesitant about, you know, supporting the station and thinking creatively outside the box in terms of new ways of resistance. And as I said, it's one of the darkest days in the history of the United States. It's also one of the brightest days because General Michael Flynn has pled guilty and will be sentenced for lying to the FBI. And I think this is now the 4th member of the regime, I use that term, the regime in Washington's staff that has been indicted, and I think more will follow. So we still have remnants of the rule of law in this country. But as we've seen, when other states have descended into fascism, it is law that is compromised. And we're looking and seeing, for example, the great leader denouncing judicial opinions, singling out judges, humiliating them in public, singling out the media, my profession, as the enemy of the American people. Who is the enemy of the American people? The fraudulent occupant of the Oval Office, or people like David Barsamian or Matt Taibbi or Noam Chomsky or Glenn Greenwald or Jeremy Scahill, or the people that are fighting for justice? Which side are you on? That was an old Union song from the 1930s, you know, in the Kentucky coal mines. Are you with the Union? Are you with the Union breaker, the owner of the mines, or are you with the workers? So it's, you know, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? They say down in Haines County there are no neutrals there. You're either for the Union or a thug for J.H. Blair. Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? So J.H. Blair was the head of the company in Haines County in Kentucky. And so this song was sung when there was real solidarity in this country with working people in the 20s and 30s, when there was an active union movement. And that, of course, capital had to crush that. Capital had to move against unions, defang them, make it more and more difficult to organize, to a point where today, from a peak of 35 to 40%, we only have about 8, 9, or 10% of our working force organized. So, you might think, well, that's a good thing, you know, I'm not paying union dues, I don't have to go to boring meetings, I don't have to read emails. That's just where the bosses want you. They want you isolated, they want you atomized, they want you separated, not to come together and to act, because then you're a powerful force. And you're just one guy, hey Michael, that's just Michael. That's his opinion. He doesn't like the way I run my company. Tough luck. Find another job. I got 18 underage, you know, Central American refugees that are willing to work for less than union wage, less than the minimum wage. So there's so much work to be done. And by the way, this book is there are only 4 copies left, but I'm really glad to know that there's going to be a book discussion around this. So if you don't get a copy, one of the 4 left, I'm going back to Boulder tomorrow. I'll mail it to you. You'll have it by the middle of next week, I promise. And I hate to give this little commercial break here, but I have to. The real bargain for you tonight are 4 new alternative radio programs for 20 bucks. If you ordered them from Boulder, it would be 75. Nancy McLean on the origins of right-wing populism. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, a Native American historian, from genocide to resistance. Henry Giroux, who's absolutely brilliant, he's from Canada. Orwell Huxley and the New Authoritarianism. And Richard Wolff, Capitalism versus Socialism. So I hope you pick these CDs and books out. Make copies of the CDs, spread them around, get the word out there, support independent media. Now, I bet there are a few people out there, just a few, old enough to remember a class that used to be taught. It's called penmanship. You don't remember? Okay, 1 person, 2, okay, 3. It was the art of writing clearly. Now, why do I make a silly joke like this? Well, everywhere I go, I hand out a sign-up sheet so I can keep in touch with you about alternative radio, and when I get back to Boulder, I can't read 3/4 of the names because they're scribbled. So if you'd kindly just give me your name and email and write clearly, I'd be most appreciative. Maybe we could start over here. And don't worry, I'm not going to share this with the FBI or the NSA, because they already have all your information. It's all locked up in $1 billion building in Utah, by the way, for which we have paid for, where all our information is stored about emails and personal phone calls and the like. One of the things I learned from Howard Zinn, our wonderful radical historian who is a dear friend and mentor, was to use humor, to use humor in presentations. And you know the left can get really boring and didactic sometimes. Hey comrades, the end is near. It's worse than you think.